Something went wrong. I'm sorry. Are you there? Hello? Hello?
Yeah,
You are
I'm
there.
here.
Yeah, we're
Is
here.
it okay?
Yeah.
Something just went off. I don't know why. Any case, so this is what the Americans were up to. Um, the that is the situation. The buildup is proceeding. The logistical operation is proceeding, and the Americans by '67 are launching these initiatives in the remote areas, remoter areas, the uplands along the DMZ against whatever concentrations of troops. And I'll speak about this in more detail, the communists, meanwhile, were thinking, well, what the heck can we do faced with this overwhelming invasion on the part of the United States? How can we militarily confront this situation? Well, basically, they said from a political and military point of view, their conclusion was they had to do something. And they decided that the best course was basically to draw the Americans away from the cities and towns, the major bulk of the American combat troops, to have them fight in the Central Highlands or at the DMZ, and meanwhile, to launch a surprise attack on the cities and towns, including Saigon. And this was the foundation of the so-called Tet Offensive, which broke out in January of 1968. So the communists developed a counter strategy, is what basically I'm saying, and this became so a very important thing. Then is to sort of understand the play of forces. First of all, with all their bombing and operations, I would say that the Americans were unable to sort of root out the infrastructure of the National Liberation Front. It was in the villages, and we should be clear, about 1/3 of the peasants supported them. One third were neutral, and 1/3 were opposed to the National Liberation Front. Meanwhile, I'm just trying to describe the overall situation as we move further. That was the overall situation. But one thing that happened as the Americans intruded themselves in this massive way was especially the bombing. And I told you there was the bombing of the North, but the bombing in the South was tremendous. And so a lot of peasants, many of whom were the ones who did not support the National Liberation Front, left the countryside. They left the countryside. They were in fear of their lives, and they didn't want anything to do with the communists, so they cleared out. So the actual situation in the countryside, what happened was that large numbers left, and I have the figures. In 1964, the demographic statistics show that only 26% of the South Vietnamese population lived in the towns and cities. By 1971, 43% lived in the towns, including Saigon especially, which grew hugely. In other words, people were fleeing the countryside and the bombing, mainly people who could have cared less about the communists. But the others remained. In other words, those who were loyal to the National Liberation Front remained in the countryside. They lived in caves or whatever the way they could. Remember, I told you Huntington, the Harvard political scientist, called this forced modernization. Forced modernization. People were outraged. This is modernization. You just bomb people. The other thing was that the strategy of the Americans, of course, was the idea that if you bomb enough, the peasants will leave the countryside and the communists will not be able to find refuge in the villages, because I explained that the insurgency is based on the villages. Well, if you uproot everybody and force them into the cities, the communists cannot take refuge in these villages. Well, it didn't turn out that way. The supporters of the NLF tended to remain, and those who were against fled to the cities. Now, when they went to the cities, of course, they were newcomers. They came from the countryside and they had fled with virtually nothing. So they were paupers. They were poor people, refugees, basically. And the point is that these people, one historian has described them as a chaos of fallen leaves, from the trees, such as we're experiencing now. They just fall in random into the cities. And these people are so beset with survival, mere survival and so on, they are not the basis for sort of organizing a political and military resistance against the communists, is basically what I'm saying. They were just fleeing into the city. That was the situation. So it was from this group that the Republic of Vietnam recruited whatever troops they could. The younger men amongst this population is about 4 or 5 million refugees. What could they do? The only way you could make a living was to join the army. They did join the ARVN, but they were not good fighters. The ARVN, except for certain elite units, there are elite units, but most of the ARVN troops faced with the NLF or the PAVN fled in terror. That's the reality. They were, except for guard duty and so on, they were largely useless, except for some elite units. So that was the situation in the towns from a military point of view. At the same time, also General Tu was in charge. General Tu, remember, 63, Diem falls, is then political chaos, coup after coup. Well, finally, General Tu takes over, and he does create a certain political stability. And he does this in 2 ways. First of all, he has his loyal officers. At the same time, he has good relations with the Chinese and the Vietnamese middle class, the bourgeoisie in the town. On the basis of these army officers and on the basis of the support from this middle class, he organizes a regime. But these people were not interested in war. They were interested in making money. Okay, they were. This was the nature. So I'm saying that the rank and file in the ARVN were not good, and the generals were not really serious military officers for the most part. Obviously, there were exceptions. And all of it floated on American aid. That's very important. The whole thing was based on the continuous access to billions and billions of dollars of American support. And of course, in the first instance, the money went to the generals and officers of the army. It went to the middle class, Chinese and Vietnamese. And these people, in their spending, in their consumerism, in their real estate speculations, there was huge real estate speculation going on, and particularly in Saigon. They created a mini boom in Vietnam with the American presence, the GIs and so on. There was a boom in Saigon especially, but elsewhere as well. And so there was a kind of artificial prosperity. Now, I would say as a result of all of that, the populations of the towns were not interested in the National Liberation Front. Of course, underground in the cities, there were communist cells everywhere. Don't get me wrong. Of course, they had their supporters in the thousands, but the great bulk of the population, refugees, people who didn't like the National Liberation Front, they were not interested. And that's, I'm saying that because it explains the outcome of the Tet Offensive. In the first instance, the communists thought that if they launched this offensive, and it was very strong, against the towns, they invaded the towns, the urban population would rise up and confront the Americans. But that did not happen, as you'll see, except in certain pockets. It did not happen. And what I've just, this outline I gave you, the nature of the setup in the towns, who was in the towns, largely explains why the communist offensive in the end failed militarily. From a political point of view, that's another story. The Tet Offensive was a brilliant success politically, particularly as a result of its effect on American public opinion and political thinking back in the United States. When the Americans saw this, what was going on in Vietnam, the support for Washington evaporated in the United States. It evaporated as a result of the Tet Offensive. But from the military point of view, as a matter of fact, the communists did not succeed, and the Americans were able to rally and drive the communists out. However, war is not simply about military. That's the point. War is not simply about military operations. War is politics by another means. Who said that? Does anybody know? A war is politics by another means. Clausewitz, the great military theorist of the early 19th century. War is politics by another means. So the Tet Offensive did have an impact, and a huge impact, but it was more political than it was military. Now, also, I should point out that there was no land reform. No, there was no land reform until late in the game in 1971. They passed the law, but most of the land had passed into the hands of the National Liberation Front by then. Now, having said this, this is a sort of context. We should note that by 1967, 65 was the first anti-war demonstration. By 1967, anti-war sentiment in the United States had grown by the millions, It's estimated that something like 40% of the population basically wanted an immediate end to the war in Vietnam, 40%. After Tet, it was become a majority. But by the time the Tet Offensive happened, 40% of the population had basically decided that this war was a loser. And what that meant and how this unfolded, you'll see in the next class.